குக்கரி சேனலை பார்த்து யார் வேணாலும் சமையல் பண்ணலாம். ஆனா சுவையான சமையல் பண்றது எப்படி? நான் இதயம் நல்லெண்ணெயில சமையல் பண்றேன். ஆஹா ஓஹோன்னு பாராட்டுறாங்க. நீங்களும் இதயம் நல்லெண்ணெயில சமையல் பண்ணுங்க, பாராட்ட வாங்குங்க.
தினம் தோறும் வாங்குவே இதயம் இதயம்.
I'm really very touched by all that you've done, the manner in which you have responded to this project of mine on which I worked, as was mentioned earlier, for over 7 years. And while I was working on it, if anything, I was conscious of how unpopular the subject is, how much people are in denial over this problem across the country, especially in privileged circles, elite circles. So it was something that I did against all odds. An expression that is very commonly used in self-respect movements is that Periyar was swimming against the current all the time. So in my own small way, I also did the same while I was researching this book. And I am very deeply grateful to Mr. Thirumavalavan, the legendary MP of Tamil Nadu. I have heard so much about him. And in fact, when the book was launched, the English book was launched in 2023 at Anna Centenary Hall. The Madras launch was there. I was honored by the participation of his colleague, his party colleague, fellow MP Ravi Kumar. And what we witnessed just now was, something I saw for the first time, experienced for the first time, where an eminent person, a person of his stature, of Dr. Veeramani's stature, and with the participation of the MP, Mr. Thirumavalavan, between the two of them, they were handing out copies of the Tamil version. That was such an extraordinary experience for me. I've never seen anything like that. And I must say that even at that English launch 2 years ago, Mr. Thirumavalavan's friend, Mr. Ravi Kumar, did something similar. On his own, he made this surprise announcement that he was so taken up with this book that he offered a discount from his side, that 50% discount. Whoever buys it can collect the balance from me. And even as the function was going on, people had queued up, to collect that balance. So such unusual experiences I've had in Tamil Nadu. That's really on the lighter side, but it's a measure of the engagement with the cause. And I could also relate to the fact that this is a demonstration of how this whole self-respect movement is so driven by its engagement with books, with intellectual engagement. You have the leader himself handing out copies of the book, and fortunately the publisher, the Tamil publisher, readily agreed to offer a discount. So it was wonderful, so many copies were handed out at the beginning of this event. Very touching, that whole experience is. And I hope this has a cascading effect, and more people across the state who couldn't have been here would also in due course see this book. And I certainly believe that this book needs to be read, in particular in Tamil Nadu, because when I set out to write this book, it was meant to be a book on violence. The reason being that my earlier books were on mass violence, both of communal nature. The first one was on the 1984 Delhi carnage, and the second one was on the 2002 Gujarat carnage. And I wanted the third book to complete a trilogy on mass violence. I wanted a third book to be on caste atrocities, targeting Dalits. But as it happened, when I was doing my research and I began the first draft, I realized that I was again and again running into a certain pattern, that some arm or the other of the Indian state, be it the police, the prosecuting agency, the trial court, or even the appellate courts, I mean, it could be the High Court or even the Supreme Court in some cases, would be complicit in the cover-up, in those cases resulting in impunity, in wholesale acquittals of the accused persons, even after they had been convicted in lower courts, or in some cases, even after they had been given death sentence, which is something that is reserved for the rarest of rare cases. But miraculously, the appellate court would find some reason to not merely lower the sentence, but acquit them altogether. So I could see that no matter what the nature of the evidence was, they would contrive some way of exonerating them. There was clearly an indication of a structural bias that was at work. I wanted to understand where the structural bias was coming from. I felt the need to engage with that ambitious question, because otherwise the reader also might find it a little predictable. Okay, there's one case, Kilvenmani or Melevelu. Again and again, it's resulting in some very undesirable consequences on the legal front. So why is it happening that way? So I needed to understand that. So I was looking for guidance from the existing literature on caste, which is, as you all know, is very formidable. A lot of research has been done by academics across the country, but somehow the legal aspects of caste were underexplored or neglected. And that is the reason why I got no guidance from the existing literature. And that led me to the archives. And then one thing led to another, and I found myself, in possession of very rich archival material from legislatures and courts going back 200 years. Why 200 years? Because as it happens, the colonial rule, whatever its faults might have been, was very good at documenting things, and everything was all spelt out there, these battles. And I must mention that these battles had to do with not just untouchability. Untouchability was, after all, the symptom, the extreme symptom of a malaise that was deeper, that had religious sanction, that had cultural sanction. So this is something which concerned everybody. Caste was something that affected people across the board in varying degrees and forms. And of course, the worst affected were the ones at the bottom, who in Tamil Nadu, in Madras Presidency, were referred to as Panchamas, right? So I found, for instance, there's a chapter in my book on intercaste marriage. That's something that does not just affect the lowest rung of the hierarchy. There were victims even in higher castes. And it's a subject that should resonate particularly here, because for all its progress, Tamil Nadu has the dubious distinction of hitting the headlines ever so often for the high incidence of honor killings caused by just the fact that some youngsters chose to follow their heart and marry, irrespective of the caste barriers. And the fact that their own family members, very often their own parents, were directly involved in the killings would show how real the problem is. And we are not talking about something that happened in the distant past. These are things that are happening in the 21st century, as recently as in this very year, right? So you know about that case involving Kevin and so on and so forth. So that only showed how valid this whole examination of legal aspects were. So even though I'm just a journalist, as he pointed out, I found myself, dealing with archives that are normally the domain of academics, and by default engaging with all these things that happened in the distant past, something that normally only historians do. But I applied the techniques of journalism, which is we have a way of sussing out stories and constructing, interesting narratives out of a mass of material that is there before us. And since I represent a confluence of journalism and law, I've long dealt with legal, human rights, and social justice issues. So organically, this book developed, and normally you would think that if you have made an incremental addition to the existing literature, that is enough of a justification for the book to have been written. But in this instance, and this is not how it was planned at all, by default, the way it turned out was that every chapter has a wealth of new material. And this was something that was corroborated even at that book launch 2 years ago. I'm mentioning merely the Chennai event, the one that took place at Anna Centenary Hall. So we had a range of experts, people like Justice Chandru, V. Geeta, Meena Kandaswamy, Virdalai Rajendran. They were all talking about how, much of the information that was written in this book came as an eye-opener to them. I was in particular touched by the fact that something as significant as, say, the first ever law that was passed against untouchability was here in Madras Presidency. And it was by a person whose existence was unknown to experts in Chennai engaging with caste or Dalit activists. And it was no fault of theirs. It was because of the bias in the way, literature is produced or research is conducted, that such unsung heroes never got their due. Much of this kind of very vital information, such huge milestones, fell through the cracks. And the importance of this first ever law is, as I said, it is by a legislator from Madras. And what is particularly heroic about it is by a legislator who was a Dalit himself. But so little is known about him. There was no clarity on whether he was a Periyar or Arundhatiya. There was a divided opinion on it because people were unfamiliar with the identity of R. Veerayan. So at that event, such questions were raised, and at a subsequent event organized by Chinnaya Lakshmanan, there was further interest among Dalit circles, and a couple of them undertook the mission of finding out who this hero was, who did this pioneering work, And it's an amazing piece of work because, given his background, it was but natural for Veerayan to draft a legislation which saw untouchability as an offense, as a penal offense. Now, this was a civilizational breakthrough. Why do I say so? Because for centuries, this was the way of life. This is how society, especially the privileged circles, the upper caste, the so-called twice-born caste and dominant caste, they dealt with people of lower castes, as they were called, in a certain way. South India was not only rife with untouchability. Untouchability is an all-India problem. As some experts pointed out before me, it was a place where there was also unapproachability, or in some cases even unseeability. What it meant was that one couldn't walk on the same street. And in a place like Travancore, they even had measurements. Oh, if you are a Pulaya and the person coming from the other side happens to be a Nair, then you will ensure that you don't come closer than a certain distance. And if the other person happens to be a Nambudri, then the distance has to be even greater. Why? Because he is higher up in the hierarchy. So it was developed into some kind of a perverse fine art. So we are talking about the place that was worst afflicted by untouchability, and in such a society, a legislator like Veerayan comes up, and against all odds, he mobilizes support for this legislation in an assembly that is dominated by dominant caste or upper caste, and the British authorities were going to be backing him only if he demonstrates enough support for it. So he would have had to be somebody who doesn't just have his heart in the right place, but also take a lot of trouble, be very skillful at negotiating and all that. And he manages to come up with a bill, not just a bill that passes muster, that gets enacted in that assembly, dominated by non-Dalits, dominated by upper caste. And what does that bill say? It treats it as an offense. Why do I emphasize on it? First of all, this is the first ever law. This happened in 1926. Just to put it in perspective, Ambedkar became a legislator only the following year in 1927. And his Mahad Satyagraha took place in 27. So what Madras did, it showed the way. This happened in 26, even prior to that. And then to put it in perspective all over again, from the point of view of upper caste, now about a decade later, after the 1935 Government of India Act, Congress participates in the election that takes place, and Rajaji becomes the premier. That's the designation that was used for the head of the province. He becomes the premier, and he comes up with a legislation that is recorded in history as the first ever legislation. The one that was enacted by Veerayan was erased from the minds of people. It found no mention in history books. What is talked about, what is tom-tommed, is the one that Rajaji did a decade later. But that's not the whole story. The whole story is that the bill that, the legislation that Rajaji government enacted, was inferior to the one that this man, a private member of the assembly, or it was actually then called Legislative Council, Madras Legislative Council, succeeded in enacting, the Veerayan, right? In what way was it inferior? Veerayan actually got the concept of legislation criminalized. He even put in that bill, in order to mobilize support, he had to put very small penalty. It was a baby step, but he actually, conceptually, he drove home the point that it was an offense. But when Rajaji came up with his bill, with all that it says is that courts will not give effect to any custom that perpetuates untouchability. It is, however, silent on what would happen when somebody commits untouchability. It would not do anything about it. It does not treat it as an offense. It just says, you don't, if somebody says that Dalits should not be allowed to walk on the street because of a certain custom, you don't recognize such a custom. But if somebody blocks Dalits from entering that street, or if they perpetrate untouchability in whatever form, no remedy is available in that. It is not treated as a crime. And the reason for that is, he comes from a background where he had to be mindful of the fact. I mean, I'm trying to look at it from his point of view. He had to be mindful of the fact that this was not, there was no, in legal terms, there was no mens rea, meaning there was no criminal intent on the part of somebody who was trying to keep Dalit away. This was the only way of life he knew. This was what he thought his religion required him to do. So people like Rajaji, though he knew better, he felt that this is something that had to be done incrementally. So be that as it may, they had their own reasons, but this is something that we in this day and age should know clearly about. This was the trajectory. This was the zigzag route. This was how this whole attempt to rein in untouchability or attempt to reform the caste system had evolved, the legal aspects of it. So these are, I was just giving you a flavor. There are innumerable such instances. A lot of them are from Chennai, but there were many from other places too. And the reason why a lot of them are from Madras Presidency is because I discovered in the course of this research that the Madras Presidency and Travancore, and Madras Presidency included Malabar, the degree, the intensity of untouchability was greater here than in the rest of the country. And there seemed to have been a bit of dialectics at work. So this was the reason why, say, somebody like Veerayan pulled off the first ever legislation. And before that, there was another first, which we hardly celebrate, which is that in the whole of India, British India, the first ever legislator from the Dalit community was again in Madras. This was in the year 1919, thanks to the then governor of Madras, Wellington. He did it on his own. It was not as if Congress party asked for it. It was not as if Justice party asked for it. They were asking for greater representation. They were asking for reservations, for seats in the assembly, in the legislature for non-Brahmins. But they didn't go to the extent of asking this man that in that limited franchise that was available then, very elite electorate it had. You had to have certain land, certain educational qualifications to be voters. So they were least likely to ever elect a Dalit. So it was entirely this man's, Wellington's idea that the only way these people whose very sight is considered to be polluting can ever sit at the high table and be addressed as Honorable Mr. Honorable Mr. M.C. Raja. Now that is also a civilizational breakthrough. Otherwise, that same person, his sight is polluting to me, but because of that colonial intervention on the issue of caste, prejudice, this is what was forced on the privileged sections of our society. Now, this is an amazing thing. Now, we are so accustomed to, reading history as written by these dominant interests that such amazing details, such amazing stories got left out. And if you look at them closely, you realize that these are moments that we should be celebrating. And, there was, before I end, I will talk, since I am addressing a gathering of self-respect movement, I want to first begin by saying I have one small unsolicited suggestion to give. As I read more and more of the great man, Periyar, I find that he was in no way his thoughts, though he did not have the advantage of going abroad like Ambedkar did and getting not one but two PhDs and becoming a lawyer from Britain and all that. He didn't have any of those advantages. He is a completely indigenous and organic intellectual. But his thoughts, his ideas were no less radical. In fact, in his lifetime, he was more successful than Ambedkar in transcending the perception of being a sectarian leader. Till the end of his life, Ambedkar was often seen as not just a leader of Maharashtrian Dalits. Very unfairly, he was tagged as a leader of Mahars, his community. But when it comes to Periyar, nobody hardly saw him as a Naikar leader. Given the way he engaged with caste, given the way he did his campaigns, his propaganda, his speeches, his interventions, he connected with castes across the Madras Presidency and beyond in his own lifetime. Whereas Ambedkar became what he is today much after his death, because of the advantage Ambedkar had of writing a lot of stuff in English. He also wrote in Marathi, but a lot of it is in English, and in a manner that is very accessible to people around the world. So, post 1990, he's become much bigger than he was ever in his lifetime. Whereas Periyar was a big leader connecting with castes across the state, and after his lifetime, he had very worthy successors. Most notably, Dr. Veeramani, who carried forward in many respects the work that he did. So the suggestion I want to make is that I was very struck by, I'm coming just now from a symposium in Madras University on 100 years of self-respect movement. It's indeed a happy coincidence that this Tamil version has come out at a time like this, coinciding with this centenary. And I also happened to visit yesterday some of the places where Dr. Veeramani has been doing amazing work near Trichy and Tanjavur. And one amazing project of this is called Periyar World. I don't know if any of you are aware of what he's doing there, building a huge statue. My mind was blown by this idea of putting another statue in front of Periyar's statue, and that statue was an abstraction. And what was that? It was deeply symbolic of what Periyar fought for all his life, which is to instill in people the courage to question everything, not be intimidated by any authority, even if that authority happens to be administrative or religious or cultural or whatever. Question. Accept only what is in accord with your conscience, with your understanding, with your common sense, and so on and so forth. So they are putting actually a question mark. That I thought was amazing. So that was just another indication of how his followers are so much in keeping with the spirit, as I understand from the little I have been able to read of Periyar. Why am I qualifying it? Because I am aware that not all his writings are available in English, and unfortunately I don't have access to what's in Tamil. The suggestion I wanted to make in all humility is that perhaps what happened in Periyar's lifetime in 1944. And Periyar is somebody who said, don't take even my word as gospel. Question me also. And if I said something, it is, this concept of Suya Maryada marriage is of this year. 2 years or 5 years later, I might have some other ideas about it. He was always open to keep on, improving on whatever he did earlier, right? So in that same spirit, I would suggest that we should not, perhaps, we should review this, you should review this label that Periyar adopted in 1944. He renamed Self-Respect Movement and Justice Party. The two entities were merged into Dravida Kalagam. Now, I understand the spirit in which he used the word Dravida, but I would think that here is a man whose ideas are so universal, so timeless. People across the country, people across the world, just like Ambedkar is connecting with people across the world, Periyar is no less. But then there might be one barrier, which is the word Dravida might give that impression, rightly or wrongly, that this is something that is meant only for this area, or people who are referred to as Dravida, or people who speak Dravidian languages, or whatever. So I would think that it's somewhat probably limiting. You could review that. And so my last point was that I had occasion to write in this book a chapter on self-respect marriage. It comes in a chapter dealing with the principle that within the Hindu framework of Hindu law, can you conceive of a marriage that is solemnized by a non-Brahmin? Or better still, can you conceive of a marriage which has no priest at all, Brahmin or non-Brahmin? Can you conceive of a marriage, look at how radical Periyar was. Can you conceive of a marriage which has no rituals that you are so conditioned to believe are indispensable to marriage? Can you conceive of a marriage, a Hindu marriage, where there is no Kanyadan? Because Kanyadan at the end of the day is about transferring ownership of the bride from the bride's father to the bridegroom. Is that consonant with self-respect of the bride? Is that consonant with the notion of equality? So he was questioning every conceivable thing. This is an example of that, right? And he ran into problems, as was pointed out. In 1953, there was early years of Indian Republic. Far from treating independence as an opportunity to promote social justice in keeping with the preamble of our constitution. What the Indian Republic ended up doing was it struck down the validity of the Suyamariyada marriage, which was in practice since 1928. Very soon after he launched the self-respect movement, and it was on very flimsy ground, saying that look, it doesn't comply with rituals that are mandatory for a Hindu marriage to be considered complete. So on that ground, when it was struck down, it meant that thousands of people who had already married under that reform, though it had no legal sanction otherwise, meaning it was not turned into a law, right? So they were all suddenly told that your marriage is illegal, and worse, your children are illegitimate. So there was a humanitarian crisis of a very large scale, right? So it required immediate intervention. And I won't go into details because I've already taken too much of your time, but there were such amazing discoveries that Rajaji came up with some legislation which was so half-hearted. All that it said was that, as a one-time amnesty scheme, your marriages will be regularized, but you will behave hereafter. There will be no such marriages anymore. So you register your marriage within the next 2 years, and then we will, save you from the consequences of marriage, your marriage being invalid or your children being illegitimate and so on. Now, when he came up with such a legislation, the Nehru government actually objected to it. There was back and forth. There was file notings on that issue. And the way this man fought back, Periyar, to ensure that that law remains the way he drafted it. But as it happened, because of some, education, caste-based education scheme that he came up with around the same time, he had to go. And then, because that judgment was never corrected, and that judgment had created this kind of a problem for self-respecters, the DMK promised in the subsequent election in 1957 that they would come up with a law redressing this problem. And they could fulfill that promise in 1967. I dealt with that debate that took place and how it all turned out and so on and so forth. And subsequently, Supreme Court upheld it. So on this positive note, on this reference to the tremendous impact that self-respect movement has had on the issue of reforming our society, I will take leave. Thank you very much.